Welcome to IMPRI Web Policy Talk. I may request our moderator for today, Dr. Gudavarthy, to take over the proceedings, please.
Yes.
Okay, so let me welcome all the panelists for today's webinar that we broadly conceptualized it as Constitution, Democracy and Citizenship in the context of essentially looking at India, but also looking at the global context of some kind of a return to kind of a constitutional language and to that of citizenship globally. Therefore, we thought that we would discuss from different vantage points that how do we look at democracy and popular politics and its interface with constitution and citizenship. That's the broad focus. And as you can see that we have an excellent panel listed here, which they would all be looking at from a legal, constitutional, and political viewpoints on constitution and citizenship. So what I will do in just about 5 minutes is to sort of
Yes,
flag
but
off.
let us also introduce you as chair, just formally for the record. Simi, why don't you go ahead? Simi? Not audible?
Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone from India. I am Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director of Impact and Policy Research Institute. And I welcome you to the special panel discussion on Constitution, Democracy and Citizenship, Circa 2020. So this is a very important topic and we need to understand several dimensions as Dr. Gudavarthy has already mentioned. And I will not take time to dwell into what discussions we need to follow or how constitutionalism and citizenship, which is emerging as an answer for which can or which must emerge as an answer to growing majoritarian democracies or not. So we have an excellent panel with us this evening. I am so fortunate to introduce to you the chair of the session this evening, Dr. Ajay Gudavarti, who is Associate Professor at the Center for Political Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. He has earlier taught as an assistant professor at the National Law School of India in Bangalore. And he has been a visiting scholar at the Center for Citizenship, Civil Society and Rule of Law at University of Aberdeen in 2012. He was a visiting faculty at Center for Human Rights, University of Hyderabad in 2011, and also a visiting fellow at Goldsmiths College, University of London in 2010. In 2008, he was the Charles Wallace Visiting Fellow at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And he has published extensively and he continues to write for noted media outlets. And some of his published work include Reframing Democracy and Agency in India, Interrogating Political Society, and Politics of Post-Civil Society, Contemporary History of Political Movements in India, published by Sage Publications. So thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to chair and moderate this session. And it is our pleasure to have this excellent panel hosted by you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Over to you.
Okay, that almost sounded like my obituary. Well, we can now I think on with what we are here to discuss. So I think Arjun, you wish to introduce each panelist as we go along, right?
Yes, I will do that. Right.
Sure, thanks, right. Okay, so let me then flag off a few issues that I think might be staring at us in this current context of looking at what does this constitutionalism and repeated references to constitution really mean? Does constitution or constitutionalism, does it refer to a kind of a spirit? You know, in the Indian context, the constitutional scholar Granville Austin referred to the Indian constitution as a social revolution. That it represented a certain kind of a deeply transformative kind of a document. And similarly, Dr. Ambedkar referred to a constitution not merely as a legal or a statutory document, but it actually represented a certain kind of a constitutional, what he referred to as a constitutional morality. However, he cautioned us that this constitutional morality is not readily available in society and Indian politics, but is something that needs to be really built. So this interface between constructing a certain morality of constitutionalism as against the available provision, how do we really today look at this interface? I think can provide us one kind of an entry point into understanding what democratic institutions, uh, the performance or the working of democratic institutions today. The second issue that I wish to really flag off is in terms of while on one hand we seem to be returning to repeated references to constitution with various protest movements, but the populist upsurge that we are witnessing globally uh, in a way has cautioned us to a certain kind of a dimension of constitution and institutions functioning, including principles of rule of law and legality in general, as something that is top down, as something that does not really speak to the available social ethos. So, are we today really witnessing? I mean, can one understand this populist upsurge and popular politics as breaking the kind of a hold liberal democracy really had? That this conjoint relation between liberalism and democracy we thought was a very comfortable cohabitation. But what we are today witnessing really is that a certain kind of an upsurge against liberalism, and we are at odds in terms of defining this cultural majoritarianism with certain kind of a popular support uh, uh, signifies a certain kind of democracy, but its tendencies seem to be deeply illiberal, and do those illiberal tendencies necessarily also make it undemocratic? I think popular consent and illiberalism today are going hand in hand, and we are really struggling to come to terms as to how does one define, given the context like India, that one cannot deny that this current regime enjoys a certain kind of a uh, popular following with some percentage. I mean, those keep differing, but there can be very little doubt this is a highly authoritarian, highly illiberal model of governance. So these two going together, where does then that leave constitution? I mean, in one sense, constitutional language today seems to be coterminous with a certain kind of an elitism, a certain kind of a vision that is top down, that represents certain socially privileged social sections and does not seem to speak to the vast range of cultural idiom or popular political idiom in which majority of populations really speak. So that would be my second question. Panelists are free to sort of reflect on this. My third issue would be in terms of constitutionalism after the neoliberal turn. That I think constitutional provisions, given kind of Indian political vision, if one goes through the Constituent Assembly debates, I think have been elaborately debated in terms of a broadly accommodative kind of a broadly inclusive kind of a framework. But I think the dynamics and the implications of this constitutional vision in a very dramatic way turned on its head after neoliberal reforms. I think I don't have the time to point towards what does this mean in terms of this kind of a while after neoliberalism, constitutional provisions have sort of turned. One argument that one can perhaps take it as an entry point is the famous intervention of T.H. Marshall on social class and citizenship, where Marshall talks about citizenship basically referring not to merely civil and political rights, but also social and economic rights. But then there have been scholars who have pointed out later on that this is not the expansion of governance or constitutional frame is not necessarily an expansion of social and economic rights and questions of equality, but it's essentially a question of what Foucault would refer to as governmentality, of regulation, of surveillance, of control, and so on and so forth. So this, I think, is my third question that really that troubles me, is that constitutional mode today has also come to refer to certain kind of a regulatory framework. I think Nyla would be reflecting on this, that how certain kind of a legality would actually refer to certain kind of a regulatory state rather than expansion of social and economic rights. So I think we are really stuck again here in terms of how certain modes of constitutional intervention on one hand look like surveillance, while they were originally seemed to be envisaged in terms of expansion of social and economic issues of justice and equality. But what they seem to have turned, and I think neoliberalism was a certain kind of a response to that kind of a regulatory framework. So where does then that leave popular politics today? Do they, the kinds of owning up of constitution that we are seeing today, again going back with CA protests, Kashmir referring back to Article 370 and constitutional promise that was made. CA protest is talking of citizenship. When Delhi riots happened, Pragya would tell us more on this. There was repeated reference to rule of law, bringing back institutions, and institutional functioning is back, in a very big way. So where does that leave the project of citizenship? I think Niranjan would also be interested in this question of where does that leave citizenship? Are we talking about some kind of an insurgent citizenship that we need, where we need to really not merely play out constitution as it existed, but sort of maybe co-opt or re-signify it in more meaningful ways. My fourth point would be, I think, on the question of ethics, that I think there is a big time reference. We are going back to the question of ethics. And I think Samir would come back in his recent book on specters of fascism. I just completed reading your introduction, your fascinating introduction, Samir. And, you lay out a vast range, and question of ethics, I think, is coming back. Question of morality is coming back in a very big way, even as we are referring to this as, fascism and populist authoritarianism. What is the equation between ethics, social ethics, and constitutionalism and citizenship? Ambedkar, was makes a very fascinating point, because Ambedkar kept emphasizing on liberty, equality, and fraternity. But he says somewhere that fraternity cannot be a constitutional principle. Fraternity is the question of a social ethics. So constitutions cannot deliver fraternity, cannot deliver solidarity, cannot offer you those kinds of mutual alliances between various subaltern social groups. So where does then that leave the constitutional frame? The popular protest politics today seem to be talking about solidarity, but they're talking in terms of a constitutional principle. Is this a kind of a compulsion of popular politics, given the kind of popular prejudice that exists on the ground between groups? I think Pragya could reflect on this when she talked about Delhi riots, equation between Dalits and Muslims, between backward castes and Dalits, between question of gender within backward caste movement. I think there is, India is in fact, I would call it, it's a kind of a prejudice machine. It's a kind of an insult machine that we have in India. One has to be a public intellectual in India to realize the kinds of insults you receive every day. And it's very much socially, I think it is institutionalized. Therefore, I think is it the compulsion of this dominant prejudice that does not offer us easy move towards larger solidarities, that we keep harping back on this vague, abstract idea of constitutionalism to rescue us, to build some frame of solidarity. And that's what Congress seems to have done in its politics of accommodation. That there is a deep division between the political constitutionalism on one hand and the social on the other hand. And this constitutionalism does not really address the question of social ethics. That is, social prejudices are left where they are, and then we keep talking about equality, solidarity, rule of law, which I think does not somehow transform these popular social prejudices in a very big way. So therefore, my final point, linking to that, would be that my own hunch is that, in spite of the popular debate in India, that cultural majoritarian politics, the kind of majoritarian that we are witnessing, whether we call authoritarianism, even building an authoritarian regime that now the Hindu right refers to as Hindu Rashtra, may not necessarily require violation of constitutional framework. It might well come well institutionalized within the given constitutional framework. Uh, uh, why should that be? Again, it's a very long debate, but I wouldn't have the time to go. But I would just add to say that partly because I think the principles, the way they're institutionalized in constitution, like principle like secularism, the way it operates in politics can be very, very different. Secularism meant a certain kind of a unity, a secular unity between various social groups, the lack of prejudice, and speaking to each other, a dialogic culture, inclusion of minority rights. But the way it worked in the Indian context, especially, it led to a certain kind of a social ghettoization of various groups. In my own writings, I refer to this as secular sectarianism. There's a deeply sectarian mode that I think the constitutional principles have sort of translated into the Indian context. And therefore, it makes me feel that to build an authoritarian, regimented, monolithic Hindu Rashtra, we may not need to break down this constitutional framework. It might well occur within the constitutional framework because what the Hindu right today is doing in India is to further build on the sectarianism, make those conflicts further sharpen them, and which they feel eventually will lead to a certain kind of a monolithic frame. So with those points, I would now open it up for the panelists. Each one of you would have about 8 minutes, and I would now request Nyla would go first. Nyla, we have been in touch for long. I should only add, I don't know whether the organizers would know, Nyla is the granddaughter of Sheikh Abdullah Saab. So we will listen to Kashmir, shall I say, straight from horse's mouth. So it's a very authentic version. She has seen Kashmir's history very, very closely. I mean, in fact, been part of experience of the changing discourse in Kashmir. And we would all agree that what is happening in Kashmir, I think, gives us a very immediate point in terms of how constitutions can be so shallow that they can be modalities of colonizing a certain kind of internal colonization. And with that, I would request Simi, would you be introducing Nyla?
Arjun. Arjun, are you there?
Arjun. Fine.
Yes, sure.
Great.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank
Please
you.
go ahead.
So let me introduce the first panelist for today's deliberation, Professor Nyla Ali Khan. Dr. Nyla Ali Khan is professor at Rose State College, Midwest City, Oklahoma, and also taught as a visiting professor at the University of Oklahoma. Formerly, she was a professor at the University of Nebraska, Kearney. She received her PhD in English literature and her master's in post-colonial literature and theory at the University of Oklahoma. Author of several published articles, book reviews, editorials, and many more, she has edited Parchment of Kashmir, a collection of essays on Jammu and Kashmir, written also 4 books, including The Fiction of Nationality in the Era of Transnationalism and Islam, Women and Violence in Kashmir, Between India and Pakistan. Ma'am have several research works and writing which focuses on the political issues and strife of her homeland, Jammu and Kashmir, India, where she visits frequently, and many of her publications in many forms and many of her lectures are available in USA, India, and many South Asian countries and many other international fora. Dr. Khan was also recognized at the Oklahoma State Capitol for her human rights work in 2018 and honored by the Oklahoma League of Women Voters as one of the 100 trailblazers for 2018. She was recently awarded the President's Volunteer Service Award and Silver Medal for her national public speaking and her bridge building work at the community and grassroots levels in the state of Oklahoma. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Arjun and Ajay. It's such an honor to be a part of this panel. So I will begin by historicizing Article 370, and I will talk about the current situation in Jammu and Kashmir as well. As I've said on other forums, the Constitution of India seeks to guarantee respect for rule of law, independence of the judiciary, and integrity of the electoral process. But time and again, provisions of the Constitution of India have been breached in Kashmir, and the ideals that it enshrines have been forgotten. In Kashmir, rights relating to life, liberty, and freedom of expression guaranteed by the Constitution, embodied in the fundamental covenants, and enforceable by courts of law have been flouted. The revocation of the special status of Kashmir without consultation with the state legislative assembly made it amply clear that parliamentary democracy in India had been unable to protect a genuine democratic setup in Kashmir. Heads of governments cannot avoid their ethical and moral responsibilities toward the peoples of states in a federal country. The lives of those people cannot be torn asunder by paramilitary forces. Now, the recent unilateral decision of Prime Minister Modi's government to revoke Article 370, which guaranteed the autonomous status of Jammu and Kashmir, bifurcate the state and demote it to 2 federally administered union territories, are violations of the sovereign constitution of India. These maneuvers jeopardize the federal structure of India. The erosion of the rights and privileges of a state is an unhealthy precedent to set in a diverse and federal country. And the curbing of political and civil rights in Jammu and Kashmir has been reprehensible. The communication and information blackout in Jammu and Kashmir for several months and incarceration of a large number of people, including elected politicians, relegated every stakeholder to the background. In effect, dissenting voices, even those of legislators and parliamentarians of opposition parties, were stifled. Ignored the statute of limitations and constitutional checks and balances that should have prevented the over-centralization of powers in Jammu and Kashmir. With the suspension of the Legislative Assembly of the former state, detention of legislators, the space for young people in Kashmir to reflect on strategies, dialogue, and accommodation which would have brought every stakeholder to the table was seriously conscripted. I would like to historicize Article 370 a little, which will make it very clear that this constitutional amendment did not benefit the local populace. On the contrary, as pointed out, was designed to benefit a particular cession of Jammu and Kashmir to India. The accession, as I'm sure all of you know, occurred on October 26, 19.
I think we lost ma'am for a while.
Looks like that. So,
Yeah. Professor Nyla, can you hear us? We can.
I think there's some connection glitch. We can...
I think she has lost the connection probably.
No, she is here. We can.
Ajay?
Yes. Professor Nyla, we can.
You can go without video.
Yes, we will bring the poster.
perhaps we should mute video. I think we should
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Ma'am, yes.
Yes, ma'am, you can go on.
Okay, so I will continue. Okay. So as I said, subsequent to the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India, the state government negotiated with the federal government to fully in the federation. Article 370 of the Constitution of India ensured that apart from defense, foreign affairs, and communications would be determined with the consent of the state government. There was a reason that autonomy was guaranteed to Jammu and Kashmir under Article 370 of the Indian Constitution. On July 13, 1950, the state government made a landmark decision. Between 1950 and 1952, 700,000 landless peasants, mostly Muslims in the valley, but including 250,000 lower caste Hindus in the Jammu region, became peasant proprietors, as over 1 million acres were directly transferred to them, while another sizable chunk of land passed to government-run collective farms. By the early 1960s, 2.8 million acres of farmland and fruit orchards were under cultivation, worked by 2.8 million smallholding peasant proprietor households. This metamorphosis of the agrarian economy, which the current federal government overlooks, had groundbreaking political consequences. This revolutionary measure, which greatly improved the Human Development Index in Jammu and Kashmir, would not have been possible without Article 370. The political logic of autonomy in Article 370 was necessitated by the need to bring about socio-economic transformations at the grassroots level. And the legislative bill which enabled this transformation won the unstinting support of thousands of erstwhile disenfranchised peasants. But displaced landlords and officials made no bones about their hatred of the political supremacy of the new class of Kashmiri Muslims. And this hatred unleashed a reign of intolerance against Kashmir's new political class. Many policymakers in the Indian subcontinent have acknowledged the effectiveness and rigor of land reforms in Jammu and Kashmir, which benefited underprivileged farmers in all three parts of the state, Jammu, Kashmir, as well as Ladakh. But the ultra-nationalist project of the predecessor of the current ruling party in India had sought to subsume religious minorities into a centralized and authoritarian state since the 1940s. Now, I would like to real quick that the Constituent Assembly of India took note of this and made provisions accordingly. Firstly, the autonomous status for Kashmir, as envisaged by the Constitution of India, was not a favor to us, but an acknowledgement of the special circumstances that constitute a part of our past and future. Secondly, autonomy was not meant for Kashmiri Muslims alone, but for the Hindus of Jammu, the Buddhists of Ladakh, and the Sikhs and Christians of the state as well. Now, the current federal government of India pays tribute to Kashmiriyat, and they make tall claims about how these recent constitutional amendments will revive Kashmiriyat. But I disagree with that, because for me, you see, having been raised in Kashmir, politics was not handed down to me as an abstract notion. On the contrary, it was crystallized for me as the eradication of a feudal structure. It was the right of the tiller to the land he worked on. It was the unacceptability of any political solution that did not take the aspirations and demands of the Kashmiri people into consideration. It was the right of Kashmiris to high offices in education, the bureaucracy, and government. It was the preservation of literatures and historical artifacts that defined an important aspect of our culture. Politics for me, and Kashmiriyat as well, was the formation of the Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir to institutionalize the constitution of the state in 1951, which was recently revoked by the federal government. And the institutionalization of our state constitution was an enormous leap toward the process of democratization. Politics for me, which, and this right was guaranteed by our state constitution, was the fundamental right of both men and women to free education up to the university level. It was pride in a cultural identity that was generated in a diverse and pluralistic state. You see, whatever we might say about the points that you made about legality, Ajay, as well as the Constitution becoming a regulatory, a tool to regulate, a tool for surveillance as well as regulation, is all very well, but trust cannot be won by the display of national chauvinism, nor can it be won by the intervention of the military in democratic spaces. Military peacekeeping, which we are seeing in Kashmir these days, isn't much different from aggressive military interventions, which is why I'm greatly appreciative of the call for the restoration of civil liberties, right to life, and right to dignity in Kashmir. And real quick, the revocation of Article 370, as well as the constitution of the state, that was followed by the Citizenship Amendment Bill. And I would like to say real quick that the Citizenship Amendment Bill, as we all know, flouts the principle of rights relating to life, liberty, and freedom of expression. In a diverse country, it is not only for the majority community to approve laws, but the minority community should also feel that constitutional amendments and laws will bring peace, security, and honor to them as well. The politics currently practiced by the federal government, their politics necessitate a rejection of pluralism and a rich cultural heritage. The diversity of India is in danger of being neutralized within a nationalist polity that destroys the nuances woven by religious, cultural, and linguistic differences. And I will stop with that, and hopefully I will talk more about these issues in the Q&A.
Thanks, Nyla, for that very powerful intervention. I think that's very important. I think it brings in very important dimensions of constitutionalism, which I think one cannot simply sort of brush them aside. So thanks. I will raise issues after all we are through with all the panelists. We'll now move on to my good friend Samir from all the way from Canada, from Simon Fraser University. Samir has been working on issues related to, he's just out with his new book on specters of fascism, where I was fortunate enough to contribute a chapter, and it I think raises very many complex issues, and we are hoping that Samir would look into some of the global context beyond India as to what is the debate in the world on constitutionalism. So over to you, Arjun.
Yes, let me just quickly introduce Dr. Gandesha. Dr. Samir Gandesha is an associate professor in the Department of Humanities and also the director of the Institute for Humanities at the Simon Fraser University, Canada. He specializes in modern European thought and culture with a particular emphasis on the 19th and 20th centuries. His work has appeared in political theory, New German critique, Kant studies, studying philosophy and social criticism, Topia, the European legacy, and the European Journal of Social Theory, Art, Papers, the Cambridge Companion to Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, a critical reader as well as in the several other edited books. He is co-editor with Lars Rensman of Ardent and Adorno, Political and Philosophical Investigations, Stanford 2012. His book, co-edited with Johann Hattel, Reification and Spectacle on the Timeliness of Western Marxism, University of Amsterdam Press, is forthcoming later this year. And he has also recently completed, also with Johann Hattel, Poetry of the Future, Marx and the Aesthetic. He has recently lectured at the Center for the Study of Marxist Social Theory and the University of Nanjing, the Taipei Biennial, and at the School of Language, Literature and Cultural Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU in New Delhi. Over to you, Dr. Samir. Please unmute yourself.
Samir, you have to unmute.
Okay, got it.
Just before you begin, I think there will be questions for all of you. Hopefully, in the Q&A, people are writing. So, I would request you to sort of, Nyla, you have a couple of questions you could sort of read through and think through.
I am compiling, no problem.
Great.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Arjun. I'd like to thank you and Ajay and the other organizers at IMPRI for inviting me to participate on this panel. As is customary, before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. It's something that we typically do before every talk, every panel discussion, every event, really just to draw attention to the fact that we are on unceded land. And I think this has some vast implications for our discussion today. So it's especially important that I did so, well, this evening for you, but this morning for me. And that's another thing, please do bear with me. It's quite early. I've been up since about 4:30 this morning. So if I stop making sense, you'll know why. So I'm given to understand that the question before us today is whether or not constitutionalism in the language of citizenship is an adequate response to the challenge of majoritarianism that we're seeing throughout the globe. And this is something that is certainly address in the book Spectres of Fascism. We set it up in terms of a global view of the rise of authoritarian populism. We ask the question as to whether or not what we're seeing globally can be regarded as fascism. And so, you know, my brief answer to the question is both yes and no. And the way I pose this in the book is in terms of the relationship between, to use a kind of, you know, Hegelian language, abstract and determinate forms of negation of let's say a constitutional or liberal democratic order. I think what we're seeing from the right, and although I do take Ajay's point about the way in which authoritarianism can function within a constitutional order, it can do so in a kind of competitive sense via contesting elections and so on. But I think the thrust of the authoritarian movements, of populist movements that we're seeing globally is to orient itself to an abstract negation of the principle of the rule of law in constitutionalism. And I think that a left response should be something like a determinate negation of this order, which is to say an argument for a radicalization of democracy, a harnessing of the liberal order in such a way as to preserve many of its important aspects, but also to bring it more fully under democratic control. And I think that, Ajay, in your introduction, you really put your finger on one of the real problems of constitutionalism is that it's increasingly understood to be, and justifiably understood to be, a top-down order, an elitist order, in which often that unelected and therefore unaccountable branch of the government, that is to say the judiciary, wields inordinate power, right? And so this order really has been exacerbated by some of the dynamics of neoliberalism, and creates this kind of contradiction that you point to in your book on Modi, in I think quite a brilliant way. And I'm also trying to address this in my attempt to bring Adorno's work on social psychology into play. And the proposition is the following. On the one hand, liberal democracy offers a kind of promise of autonomy, the idea that we can live a fully self-directed life. But the neoliberal dynamics that we've seen unleashed over the past 30, 40 years have created increasing forms of heteronomy, and people have less and less control over forces that they can barely understand. And this contradiction leads to frustration, anger, tendency to demonize the other, and it feeds what we're seeing today globally, but especially see this today in the United States, kind of conspiratorial thinking, kind of the world of alt facts, and so on. And so I think that you have a vicious circle of a constitutional order that is under threat, but it's a very constitutional order, the very liberal democratic order, which is seen to be increasingly elite-driven, that is spawning these authoritarian populist movements globally. You see this in the United States, you see it in Brazil, Central and Eastern Europe. We see it, of course, as we've been discussing, in India as elsewhere. But I want to now shift gears a little bit and say that it's not simply in these contexts that we see tendencies towards authoritarianism, but also in my country, in Canada, which is often held up as a kind of ideal multicultural liberal democracy that should be emulated in other countries. And I think that, as with the United States, which is haunted by its own legacy of settler colonialism and slavery, we have the same kinds of tensions in Canada. And I just want to go into this a little bit and then conclude. So since forming his first government in 2015, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has promised a very different kind of politics from that of his predecessor, Stephen Harper, who made clear that he had little or no interest in engaging constructively with First Nations peoples, who in the Constitution of 1982 were guaranteed provisions for self-governance. In 2012, Harper refused repeated requests to meet with then Attawapiskat Chief Teresa Spence. In response, Spence undertook a hunger strike to secure nation-to-nation meeting with the Prime Minister and the Governor General. Spence wanted to discuss the abysmal conditions on her reserve. I mean, throughout the country, there are countless Indigenous communities that have no safe, clean drinking water supply, if you can believe it. This is Canada, right? Supposedly a first world country. So to discuss the conditions in not only on her reserve, but throughout the country. And in fact, the same year, the Harper government had passed one of many omnibus bills, Bill C-45, that among other things eliminated protections for fresh water across the country. This materially threatened the traditional hunting and fishing practices of Indigenous peoples across the country, along with muzzling federal scientists and librarians and putting into place new controversial anti-terror legislation of dubious constitutionality, I should add. This was part of Harper's strategy of transforming Canada into an energy superpower or petrostate. In response to C-45, a massive outpouring of Indigenous opposition throughout the country took the form of protests, teach-ins, and traditional Native dances in shopping malls across the country. Young, social media savvy, female Indigenous activists led a kind of Canadian version of the Arab Spring called Idle No More. In contrast to Harper, Trudeau promised a new kind of politics. Sunny ways, as he put it. The new Prime Minister promised to take immediate action on climate change and also to amend the recently passed and universally criticized Anti-Terrorism Act, a piece of legislation that, as a leaked Royal Canadian Mounted Police memo would reveal, specifically targeted Indigenous and environmentalists' resistance to developmental projects. Trudeau also promised sweeping electoral reform that would see the replacement of the single-member plurality system with a version of the more representative proportional representation system. But the most important of Trudeau's promises was the one he made to Indigenous peoples across what First Nations call Turtle Island, that the government would adhere to true nation-to-nation relations between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples. This is a constitutional question of the highest order. In what seemed to be a truly historic step, Trudeau included in his cabinet the first Indigenous Minister of Justice, come Attorney General, Jody Wilson-Raybould. Trudeau's promise of a new nation-to-nation relationship aimed to distinguish his government from that of Harper's and might have been seen as a belated response to Chief Theresa Spence. It was, of course, also tacit recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, at least in principle. Despite all this, Trudeau's hypocrisy was revealed in the last 2 weeks of the recent election when he was exposed as having worn black and brown face in earlier years. This resulted in a firestorm of well-deserved criticism led, ironically, by the Conservative Party of Canada, which was not exactly known for steadfast commitment to principles of anti-racism. Yet this scandal only highlighted the relative silence surrounding a much more serious issue. This was the Trudeau government's handling of the relatively long-standing antagonism between the hereditary leadership of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation and TransCanada-owned Coastal GasLink. So this is a pipeline project worth $6 billion, which was to take or $4 billion, which was to take fracked natural gas through the ancestral territory of the Wet'suwet'en peoples. The pipeline would deliver liquefied natural gas from the Dawson Creek area to a facility near Kitimat, BC, in preparation for shipping to global markets. At issue here is a fundamental principle to which the Canadian government committed itself in its stated adherence to the UN DRIP or UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as well as to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, that in all development projects that affected unceded territories, Indigenous nations must provide their free, prior, and informed consent. In the case of the CGL, the company insisted that it had engaged precisely in such a consultation process and had signed mutual benefit agreements with some 200 First Nations across the path of the pipeline. This is taken then as evidence, or was taken as evidence, of engagement with Indigenous communities and meaningful consultation. However, these agreements had been signed with reservations, elected band councils, governance structures created by a deeply racist, misogynist colonial law called the Indian Act. The problem with band councils entering into these agreements is the fact that their writ doesn't extend beyond the reservations they were created to administer. This means that the traditional territories, such as those currently in contention, are not under the jurisdiction of these councils. In fact, and I think this is an important constitutional point, two important Supreme Court of Canada decisions, Delgamuukw versus British Columbia in 1997, and Chilcotin Nation versus British Columbia in 2014, established Indigenous communities and the traditional governance structures as possessing authority over such territories. The Wet'suwet'en have for several years now struggled hard to defend their lands, building the Unistoten camp to prevent the CGL and RCMP from accessing their territories. They insisted not only on UNDRIP and the TRC's recommendation and Canadian legal decisions establishing the jurisdiction of their traditional governance structure, but also on the authority of Wet'suwet'en law, under which all 5 clans have unanimously rejected the pipeline project. The Wet'suwet'en have also invited settler allies to come and join them on their territories and have engaged in myriad fundraising and educational activities. Despite both the normative force of UNDRIP, TRC, and legal decisions, as well as the resistance of Wet'suwet'en themselves, the federal and provincial governments, as well as the RCMP, taking direction from a private company, have doubled down on the pipeline project under the guise of consent. Insofar as the government is an enthusiastic backer of this project, it is as if the government had secured consent from itself. In fact, as The Guardian had recently revealed, the RCMP have threatened to use lethal force against the Wet'suwet'en for simply enjoying their territories. So I just want to conclude and say that here we see in this example a crisis of the constitutional order, which has to do with the past and present of settler colonialism. And this rift has only been deepened by the dynamics of neoliberalism and extractivist capitalism in the country. So I think the legitimacy crisis here that we can discern the outlines of is a version of what we see more generally, and I'd be happy to speak more about that in the discussion period. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Samir, for that. I think you brought in a very important viewpoint in terms of also I think it raises quite a few epistemic issues about liberalism itself in terms of extending what you have said. So I think we will have a lot to discuss there. Thanks for that. And we will now move on to Niranjan, who is with ORF and I've seen his work on reservations. We had, I think, some opportunity to discuss his work on reservations some time back. And now over to Arjun to introduce Niranjan Sahoo.
Thank you, Ajay sir. Let me just quickly introduce Dr. Niranjan Sahoo, who is a senior fellow with Observer Research Foundation, ORF, India's #1 think tank. Dr. Sahoo is associated with ORF's Governance and Politics Initiative. With years of expertise in governance and public policy, he now anchors studies and programs on democracy, human rights, federalism, electoral reforms, particularly issues related to political funding, which has also been recently changed in India, and cross-cutting issues of exclusion, insurgencies, affirmative action, and inclusion. A recipient of the Asia Fellowship 2009 and a former Sir Ratan Tata Fellow, he currently serves as a South Asia member for the Carnegie Rising Democracy Network, where he debates and writes on democracy, foreign policy, human rights, and other related such issues. He has authored 2 books, Politics of Power Sector Reforms in India, Pentagon Press 2007, and Reservation Policies and its Implementation Across Domains in India, an Analytical Review, which came from Academic Foundation in 2009. His 3rd book, Exclusion and Insurgencies in India, is in the pipeline. His latest co-authored monograph, Funding India's Democracy, will be published soon. He regularly contributes for academic and current affairs journals, newspapers, think tanks, and blogs, and features on television programs related to his area of expertise, and is very famous in his own domain in such issues. So welcome, Dr. Sahoo. Over to you.
Thank you, Arjun, for inviting again, and this is such a pleasure to share the idea with such a interesting group of academic and thinkers. And thanks, Ajay, for moderating and throwing the initial ideas. I think it's a great theme to debate. I don't think you'll probably find a better time for this kind of theme, especially about the idea of citizenship and democracy in India, which is going through a great churn and I would say crisis with especially liberalism and majoritarianism sweeping I mean, not many of us had imagined. Probably what we thought the fringe will remain fringe has become actually now the mainstream. So in a sense, this is pretty obvious, and we have to deal with it, and we have to see how we can actually protect and safeguard the constitutions which remains, mothership of this 70 odd years democracy. Since I cover democracy promotion for last several years, I've been covering, and I can share that this is one constitution which took so much of painstaking and so much of hard work of people like Ambedkar and Nehru and many other stalwarts. And this constitution is often referred by most of the new democracies and young democracies across the world. If you look at starting with South Asia, Southeast Asia, anywhere you go to Africa, India's democracy is actually taken as like a Bible. No, they don't look at United States or Canada or Australia for that matter, because they think culturally, in terms of diversity, in terms of historical experience, this is India comes close. In fact, I have been, I would share something that for last 6-7 years, I have several rounds of interaction with Chinese scholars who are closely reading India's constitutions and its experience. In a sense, if any chance they have to move to democracy, probably this is India could be one which from its experience and its different principles probably they can look at, not United States and others in terms of kind of a size and diversity and experience. So having said that, this is from a stage where we actually got immense laurel and so much of honor and respect, and became a symbol of kind of for many new democracies. Today we are actually at a crossroad, especially in the aftermath of the Citizens Amendment Act, which actually I would say it doesn't really alter the constitution or many of the principles. They still remain same what Ajay said, but it still hits at the heart of the secularism, the constitutionalism, because you are creating a kind of basically citizenship which in many ways will discriminate a particular group from others. So in a sense, we are actually going through a kind of a turmoil, kind of a churn, which many would not realize. They think that it is another small event, and why to make so much of fracas and noise about something which would not really affect 90% of the population in any way. And then from what the government says that this everybody else who lives in India for a certain period of time is safeguarded and protected. That's not the issue. Issue is about the principles, the ideas that actually has moved this nation. Because if you look at the kind of juncture in which we became a sort of a democracy and adopted a constitutions is something that not many political theorists actually even thought that India will actually pass the real test even first initial decade of constitutionalism and will survive as a democracy. I mean, even political philosopher like Hegel and John Stuart Mill had so much of skepticism because of our, feudal system and caste system and hierarchical, such a sort of oppressive system, which and then illiteracy and mass poverty. I mean, which John Stuart Mill clearly said that it doesn't have the capacity for democratic rule. Unlike its distant cousin like Canada, Australia, or New Zealand, which were colonial this thing of British, but then he said that they are probably better equipped and in terms of education, material base and other things. So many of them ruled out, and we actually in fact surprised the world by creating a kind of constitution which recognized straight away that the secular and inclusiveness, and it provided equality to everyone irrespective of caste, color, creed, gender, this thing. I mean, just think about America. I mean, it took 131 years for them just to give suffrage right to women, and it took many more years actually for black and other people to get their voting rights, despite the constitution enshrining the principle of equality. So I'm saying, in a sense, this is a revolutionary constitution, and then that universal suffrage, adult suffrage, and providing voting rights and enshrining the right to equality under Article 14 was something that made us, a very a different country, and we probably with all the troubles and challenges managed, for all these seven odd decades. And today we are actually witnessing, especially with this CA and then NRC process, witnessing that there is a serious probably threat to the idea of citizenship. Especially, I would say that citizenship idea will not, wither away, or it will be deleted from the constitution or the thing. But the very notion of citizenship, which in daily politics, in the day-to-day affairs of the republic, we are actually witnessing a sort of I would say very systematic kind of erosion of that, and that's happening not through, I would say, largely through the constitutional changes, but I would say the politics on the street, the mobilizational politics that's happening, in a manner that you are today witnessing a kind of new lingua franca, the kind of toxic, I would say, rhetoric, political rhetoric, which creates a kind of promotes a fear-based politics. Prejudice thrown, people are, groups are, demonized, insulted, they have to go through the daily insults, every day. It is becoming everyday affairs kind of things. And that is unfortunately the larger point. What I'm saying is that this is unfortunately being tolerated and accepted, not only by the majority of the population, who feel that this is something not good or ideal thing, or to discriminate people based on their identity, religion, or other aspects, but people are actually tolerating. So you have a elite silence actually on some of these violations and some of this kind of politics, which is actually very serious thing. And then the second, look at the institutions. Some of the institutions which are supposed to protect, I mean, if you judiciary, if you look at live out the dark record during the emergency, I think all these decades actually it probably provided some semblance of sort of protections, and in many ways it expanded those rights during the coalition period of almost 30 years. And today you are witnessing a kind of a judiciary. If you look at the habeas corpus issues, and then Article 370, you look at CAs, the judiciary hasn't even found time to actually listen, but it can actually has time to listen for a TV anchor in the midnight, or even can block 2 days actually for hearing a bail petition for a sort of a celebrity journalist. So I'm saying, in a sense, if you look at actually this majoritarianism that is sweeping, and then the political dominance of a particular group or a sort of regime has so much of impact on your judiciary and your other independent institutions, that you can easily see that priorities are changing. And you are today witnessing a kind of executive judiciary, which in many ways is a serious threat to individual liberties and the kind of constitutional rights, many things that evolved all these decades. So I'm saying the protectors are today in many ways are actually showing indifference, and probably calculated they got the political message. The third thing, I think it's also normalizing of those sort of things which you are actually witnessing, that the hate is becoming normalized, whatever actions and other things are also being normalized, and majority of populations have no conscience. I think it's business as usual. If you look at the press, if you look at even the civil society, chunk of them are actually happy with what's actually happening. So these are actually some of the things which actually should ideally provoke us and give us a reason to worry. But I'm saying, in terms of what actually Ajay said, if any idea that whether we can stop this sort of populist upsurge and majoritarianism, what he said correctly, very few tools are available at least we have seen some bit of success during what happened in the Sain Bagh and similar kind of protest that people came peacefully and sat there. Symbolically they hold the constitutions and drew the attention of the global. Today, fortunately, you don't actually have to do everything in the parliament or even in the court. You can actually do a lot of things. What's happening with the farmer protests, you look at the symbolism it carries. It goes to the every, the same social media which has become a tool of oppression by the, the ruling party or the people who control the narrative. These tools also can help and equip, even smallest minority to also, show to the world what's happening to them. So in a sense, I think these sort of protest holds a kind of mirror to the regime, and it tells them how much you can actually pinch. So in a sense, one has to build on that, and this sort of collective actions actually, however small and however fragmented, holds a lot of relevance and meaning today. And the second aspect, I think we should not also leave out the legal options, the constitutional options, the tools available, whether it's a public interest litigations, whether it's a, filing those group petitions, or, or questioning, writing, and challenging those sort of ideas or judicial decisions. Even today, I mean, you should draw a certain satisfaction that even comedians have the courage to even show the mirror to the judiciary, the highest court. I think this also shows that everyone is not, taking this thing with, sort of a that just going down to the ruler and other thing, and people are standing up. I think probably you need more examples, more courageous people, and anywhere, any regime which becomes, tyrannical and tries to, impose kind of, majoritarianism over certain groups and other thing. I think there'll be always a pushback and fight back, and that's happening on the street. What we need is probably more collective actions, more mobilizations, and more sort of spirited people to do this sort of. And you don't need actually, political opposition. Unfortunately, in this country is silent, fragmented, and in many ways actually clueless. But what's happening is, if you look at from this farmer agitation, from the Dalits, and what actually happened during the CA protest, you are actually seeing a sort of emerging of kind of a loose coalition of Dalit, Muslims, farmers. It could be women, and many way actually. And this probably hopefully will coalesce and probably converse and create because that becomes a natural sort of momentum that you always see any kind of authoritarian regime which tries to silence the minority voices and impose sort of ideas. So this has to be fought, because you are witnessing today unprecedented ideological transformation and unprecedented sort of mobilization. Probably we haven't seen this kind of scale that we are witnessing with the current regime in the power. So this has to be challenged not only in terms of ideas but also on the street. Thank you.
So thanks, Niranjan, for that very spirited presentation, that you still think there is hope with this. Yes, I think this farmers movement in a sense has been a very unprecedented kind of movement, and that's what will take us to Pragya to give us, a very lived experience, because she's visited, unlike many of us, she's been part of, she's been covering many of these events, including anti-CA, the Delhi riots, and the farmers' movement. She's with Newsclick, which is a kind of a left-oriented portal. Samir, this should interest you. That it was one of the news portals which actually covered farmers' movement in a very big way in the initial period, when many of the mainstream news channels actually did not cover much. And she's also my editor. She edits all my pieces and makes me look much better writer than what I am. So over to you, Pragya, and Arjun, of course.
Let me introduce Pragya, ma'am. But Ajay sir writes a lot in the Hindu, Indian Express, everywhere, but also in Newsclick. So thank you, Pragya, ma'am. Let me just introduce Ms. Pragya Singh, who is a senior journalist as Newsclick. And ma'am has a 2 decades experience. She has worked with many other national daily newspapers such as The Pioneer, The Indian Express, Hindustan Times, Mint, Outlook Magazine, and the First Post Print in Delhi prior to joining the Newsclick in 2019. She's a lawyer by training and writes on politics, social change, and conflicts. Ma'am has devoted much of her time in getting the field experiences and what is going on the ground. So, ma'am, without any further ado, over to you. Please unmute yourself, ma'am. Ma'am, please unmute yourself.
Am I audible now?
Right, please.
Yeah, I should be. Thank you so much, Dr. Ajay Gudavarti. I'll try and share a few of my experiences from the CA protest, anti-CA protest, and from the farmers protest, which is ongoing. Also, a little bit on the coverage of the Delhi riots, the limited coverage which I did, frankly. But I'll try to relate it with experiences from before 2014, because that's sort of become where we stop as journalists. Sometimes we stop thinking at 2014, and the past becomes a big blank. So is it that secularism is under threat now, or was our secularism sort of skin deep? You scratch the surface, and Mr. Modi gives a few speeches and it disappears. So what's really happening in the minds of people? I'll try to just sort of give you a rundown of that. So people don't generally talk about constitution when a journalist goes to meet them. They don't mention the constitution at all. In fact, most of the time, what they do talk about over the last 1 year is citizenship. Now, how people see it, those who do not agree with the CAA, NRC, NPR exercise, typically they say that the government introduced a law. The law is discriminatory. It created unequals out of citizens. Then there was a riot, and the police investigation hammered that inequality in. It made it, what was a legal inequality has become a public inequality now, meaning that the state is completely indifferent to the victims of the violence in Delhi. And those who were supporting the anti-CA protests have been labeled as urban Naxal or terrorist sympathizers or terrorists themselves. So even their little bit of support which they had is being taken away. They're actually in jail, a lot of student protesters and activists, because now the riot has been linked with the anti-CA protest. So what's really interesting is that there is a difference between how many Muslims will talk about the CAA and how many Hindus will talk about it. I'll tell you a couple of experiences from the Northeast Delhi riots. Now, this is primarily working class neighborhood with a few small home-based industries. The industries are scrap dealers, automobile repair work, textile. Little bit of ready-made garments are made and supplied to a larger wholesale market in Delhi for all three things. So the large wholesale market is called Gandhinagar. It was on the US government's radar for a very long time for copyright violation. Actually, they make fake Levi's, fake Lee jeans, and so on and so forth. And the home-based workers, who are mostly Muslim, who live in Northeast Delhi, are the ones who supply these, ready-made garments to the wholesale stores. So again, when the Northeast Delhi violence took place, then these factories shut down overnight. And then there was the COVID lockdown, which made a large number of them just flee. So you'll find, when you go there now, you'll find it's actually quite empty. There's literally no inactivity, and the unlock hasn't started happening for them in the same way as it's happening in central or South Delhi. That's one thing. The second thing is this claim of urban Naxal and terrorists. Now, if you ask someone who isn't at Shaheen Bagh or at any of the other protest sites when they were active, if you ask them what they think about the government naming them and shaming them in this way, they would always, if they were Muslim, they would respond a little differently. They would say, look, we chose this country. Our forefathers decided they wanted to live in India. And so in a way, they're trying to say that their citizenship is not based on just birth. There is a sense of belonging to India, which Hindus and Muslims naturally share. The Muslims find themselves in this milieu, asserting it more and more. We are from here. Where will we go? Our forefathers chose this country, so our claim is very strong compared to anybody else's. And through the CA movement, they also say that we are actually saying that we want to be Indians. So how can we be accused of being anti-national? It doesn't make sense. It makes sense in the BJP government's way of looking at not just Muslims, but also Dalits and farmers, and of course Kashmir. Kashmir was polarized, used as a way to polarize the whole country, right? But why Dalits? Dalits are seen as an assertion of the subaltern, and so they have to be not allowed to assert themselves. When the Dalits organized the 2nd April 2018 protest, the government was actually taken a little by surprise at the strength of their assertion, the fact that they could mobilize, hit the streets. Anyway, it quickly dissipated. It ended with jail sentences for all the Dalits who protested. All the Dalits who the government said were leading the protests. The second thing came for the Muslims. Now the government was prepared for a pushback and decided they are not going to withdraw the law. And so the same words were used for them, the same language. You are urban Naxals, and of course you are terrorists, and you are funded by anti-national forces, etc., etc. And surprisingly, now the farmers protest the same language. So the simple thing is that as a journalist, when you see the same language being used, you presume, you're safe to presume that the attitude of the state is the same towards all three, but the goals are different. With the polarizing that they do through the use of Muslims as the other, the aim is to win elections. Once you have won the election, then that justifies every other policy that you cleared, like be it demonetization, be it hastily pushed through GST, CA, NRC, farm laws. And for each of these laws, every time people are told that the laws are in their favor. So then, once they've been told that the laws are in their favor and that nothing will change, so then people are only left to ask one question: then why did you bring the law? If CA won't change anything, if farm law won't change anything, if demonetization is going to be great, then why do you need this law? But then who is listening to what people really ask? They are all clubbed together, and in all these cases, be it the farmers, be it the Dalits in 2018, be it Muslims, or people who oppose the CA in general, everybody goes to jail at some point. Half the the journalists nowadays talk among themselves that the farmers' protest would have got a lot more coverage in the media if so many student activists were not actually in jail or out on bail fighting cases. That's, and the interesting part is that I said initially that the police investigation is being used to polarize. It's not just being used to polarize, but to actually discriminate. Discriminate in the sense that once the charge sheet is filed, you're supposed to be let out on bail and be free. But here that's not happening. Instead, even after the charge sheet, the police is going after more and more students, more and more activists. Even day before yesterday, some people were arrested. So, there's a constant churn of these, news from universities is mostly news of arrests. That's what's happening. So where is the fear of losing citizenship in the CA case arising from? This is very interesting. The fear is naturally arising from the fact that Muslims know, for example, that when your citizenship is reduced to you're securing a piece of paper. So then they come and tell us, as reporters, where will we get this paper from? And slowly, as the protest went on, they realized that the Aadhaar card will not do it, the passport will not do it, the PAN card will not do it. So then they're like, what do we do? But we don't have the answer either, because the rules have not been framed. So once they get it that the rules have not been framed, then they say, but who will make the rules? And the rules have been made for Assam. So there is wholesale confusion. And in this wholesale confusion, what people want is that you don't bring this law. You simply just cancel this law, and the positions get hardened on both sides. Of course, in the case of the anti-CA protest, there is no question of having a discussion. In the case of farmers, because they're from Punjab, there are so many other concerns that the government has other than pushing its economic agenda. They want to do it peacefully. They want to shame the farmers into leaving on their own, or they want to get the farmers to agree to what the government is saying. Even if a section of farmers agrees, that will be okay. So there is great fear, not just of the law, not just of the economic reform, but the farmers are afraid that an alliance of some sort will be struck by one section of farmers, isolating those who are actually against the laws. So both when it comes to citizenship law or the farm laws or the CANRC or the demonetization, the logic is the same. You who don't agree with us are wrong, and you don't deserve to be Indians. Just the goal is different. Muslims help to polarize, win election, which justifies their policies. Dalits, you squash their rights to crush the subaltern assertion. And with the farmers, you can see the farmers as a last blockade to the economic agenda of this government. Now, interestingly, pre 2014, I went to a village called Jais, which is near in central Uttar Pradesh, which is very close to where the Gandhi family contests elections from traditionally. Now the people there, it's about 60% Muslim population. Now the Muslims say that, look, we are very tired of the secular parties. We are actually very sick of Samajwadi and Congress and even the BSP, etc., etc. This is 2017 January. There is very little talk of Muslim Dalit alliance as we talk now. We are very tired of being neglected. We have no development to speak of, no school, no college, no electricity, no home, nothing. So we would even vote for BJP. Our problem is that the BJP leaders give speeches in which they decry us all the time. They demonize us. So, why do they do that? And get them to stop, because we don't want to be poor and we don't want to live in this village either. We also want jobs. We want to move on in life. That's one thing. Switch to just a year later, we've had a spate of killings over cows. It's about 8 or 10 cases which were highly publicized. We've had a number of judgments which are unfavorable to the victims, and the narrative changes. Now when you talk to people, especially members of the minority community, they say that, look, we chose this country. Now we didn't just choose the country, but we let go of a lot of political parties who could have represented us. We vote for Samajwadi, Congress, etc., etc., but they never speak for us. So what are we to do? And a year later we get the answer. They will vote for whoever at least gives a expression to how they feel, which is parties like Owaisi, who won't do anything. At least, I mean, AIMIM hasn't done anything, but it has spoken a lot. The members of the party, gave a lot of speeches which are very cathartic. So those cathartic speeches are drawing people. This had to, a lot of people feel this had to happen. Now, another year passes and you have a riot in Delhi. But this time, something did change. One, the idea of citizenship, even if people don't draw upon the constitution in their conversations, I said they draw on the citizenship a lot for the older, for families which are the older generation living with them. The memory of the partition is still there in North India. So that partition memory is, it's very, very fascinating, because people see their citizenship as arising from the fact that they live here, a sort of ancestry. They do not see it in legal terms, as in, I was born in 83 and therefore I have to prove this and that and get this document, or I was born before 2003, so I have this, that. No, they're just very clear about it. The partition happened, we were here, we are here, we belong here. The second thing is that the BJP did not win the Delhi election. Now, the reason they didn't is because the idea of citizenship is being contested. Is it a civic idea of citizenship which is, dwells on your rights, your water, electricity? Is it a citizenship which is based on who's in and who's out, and so on? The people who live in a area that's been affected by violence, especially the Muslims, both in Muzaffarnagar and in Northeast Delhi, it was the Muslims who were victimized. They tend not, after the violence has passed, and for a long time after that, they do not get into the blame game, because a lot of them are considering that they will have to continue living where they were living, right? So those who are very angry, their friends and family generally explain to them not to vent their spleen, not to express themselves in harsh language against Hindus, etc., etc. So they do look for political alternatives to the BJP, and so do the Hindus whose family members get arrested and who do not gain really from the rioting. After the 2 days of mayhem, they do tend to confront, now what? That now what moment comes, especially in a city where your land records, where your housing records, your property records go to the police after an incident like this. And there the police settles claims based on who's entitled and who's not. You in a village setting, in a setting like the 2013 Muzaffarnagar riots, where you force a community to withdraw from the shared villages, and then you occupy their lands and their buildings. Delhi is very different from that. Also, the media's role. In the case of Muzaffarnagar riots, the government stopped the publication and distribution of newspapers 2 days before the riots. So people had only rumors to rely on. In 2020 in Delhi, the media is doing the job of propaganda and rumor mongering, right? So then who do you stop? So when you tell people that, but this isn't true, so, ordinary Hindu women walking around the streets, taking rickshaws, when you ask them what they think about CAA and NRC, they turn around and say, Acha hai, it's very good. Other countries have such a system. So when you ask them that, which country can you name, they say all countries have the system, because I know it comes on TV. You take your cues from there. But the political alternative is there. Like in Delhi, there was Aam Aadmi Party which won. Some say that it won by the skin of its teeth. A week more of this propaganda, BJP leaders moving around would have meant a different outcome. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the contestation is happening, and us and them is not the only narrative you hear on the street. Even after an incident like Delhi, where so many people died, uh, both the Hindus and the Muslims who fought turn around and say, look, this was politically motivated. So people do understand certain things are political. When it comes to nationalism of the BJP kind, they get swayed. That's the one challenge which I could never really answer that question when people ask, but what's wrong with it? That it's discriminatory, but so what? Everything is discriminatory. They live in one room houses. They don't have proper jobs. They don't have proper services of any kind. So that's generally what I saw. And all of this happened because the BJP government brought in a discriminatory law. That law discriminated on paper, and it turned into public discrimination very soon after that. That's it.
Yeah, Dr. Ajay, over to you. Ajay, sir.
Okay. So thanks to all of you. As I think, just as Arjun, you wanted an elaborate discussion. I hope it happened and you're not disappointed with. I think there have been great presentations, and we have got the kind of insights that we were really looking for in terms of. So what I'll do is to flag off questions for each of the individual panelists, and then we can sort of have some answers, reflections from you all. And if you have some questions for other panelists, we can do that after you, after my after I speak, and then we can take questions in the third round and then conclude. So to begin with, Nyla, thanks for that presentation. I would have pointed issues in terms of issues that you have really raised. Uh, is that the general anxiety in India today is that uh, the, the narrative in Kashmir itself has sort of moved away from that of self-determination to that of an ethnic nationalist, Muslim majority kind of state, formation. And it seems it's very difficult for us to really draw. While in academic discourse, we can make this distinction, know that it's more about self-determination rather than an ethnic imagination of an ethnic citizenship. But in popular imagination, it's extremely difficult for us to convince anybody beyond Kashmir to say that this is purely an issue of self-determination and therefore it's a secular Kashmirian and not in my own surveys, that when I visited Kashmir, there is a popular, all my respondents invariably said, when I said, what are you looking for? What is this struggle all about? They invariably say it's about Islamic State, that we want an Islamic state in Kashmir. Whatever that might mean, they may not have, some of course say they need, Hadia, they need some kind of an Islamic law, but others, I think, have a very vague imagination of what that means. So where do you, as a scholar of Kashmir, really draw this very important distinction? Has Kashmir moved away from that kind of an old struggle of self-determination? Has it been pushed to the wall? So that's my first question. Where do we? The second is really your emphasis that you brought about on federalism. That that other scholars have also been talking about recently. Partha Chatterjee argues that one bet we have, the best bet we have against monolithic majority in India is federalism. That regional variation is really the way we can question. But as you know, much of federal politics in India uh, are very transactional in nature. Kashmir could be an exception, but that will be interesting that most states and regional parties are very transactional kind of politics. Can they really take on a kind of politics that is so ideologically, or well organized? They have an ideological mission, but federal parties don't look to be so. They're more in terms of everyday transactions, what to deliver, where, what kind of benefits to give, what kind of welfare. Can this kind of transactional politics really ever be able to take on some kind of monolithic politics? And my third pointed question to you would be that I think BJP has an interesting strategy all across India, and in just in that sense, in that case, uh, Kashmir is not an exception for BJP. That there is a general discontent against local regional leaders. That all politicians are corrupt, whether it is national conference or whether it's PDP, they're not really delivered. And therefore, BJP is betting it's this kind of a narrative. While Kashmiris are too smart to see through this game, but rest of India, this is what is happening. That they mobilize not just through a monolithic kind of a thing, but bottom up. They are providing a kind of an articulation for local discontent. uh, uh, Kashmir is different in this case, but why the reason why BJP succeeds in Telangana, the state I come from, is that they hit the right note.
Yeah.
That there is a local discontent, the regional leader, the price of representation, and BJP works like an outsider, like some kind of an anti-establishment.
Yeah.
So do you see that, so how do we then generate a local discourse when you cannot simply have a critique when there is so much of local discontent, and there seems to be we are caught in a catch-22 situation that local is not the solution, national is breathing down the neck, constitution is violent. So Kashmir is really sort of pushed to the wall where we do not see easy alternatives. And to Samir, thanks for that very detailed presentation. I'll pick on the more. Samir, are you around? If Samir is not around, I'll
Yes,
go.
yes, Samir sir is around. His video is on.
I can't see his video as he's sort of gone to pick up some coffee or something. Samir, are you around? I think he's just gone.
No problem. We can go to the next panelist.
Let me talk Niranjan, and then once Samir is back. So Niranjan, thanks for that presentation. You made interesting points on Chinese looking forward to Indian constitution, not Indians, but the Chinese are trying to learn from. China is an interesting place. You know, they're also getting my book on India after Modi translated into Chinese. I don't know why. They, I think, know more of authoritarianism. They also want to learn new tricks from Modi. I really don't know. But China seems to be an interesting case to understand authoritarianism in the current context. In fact, I tell many friends that they're translating the book in all probability for wrong reasons. But I think you touched on one important point on adult suffrage. I think that's a key point in understanding post-independence nation state. You know that India really it was a very radical move when compared to even European history, which went in phases. India went all out for a universal adult franchise. But having said that, I get a sense, you know, that this old kind of a Nehruvian social democracy and the old kind of a Nehruvian notion of inclusion and equality was based on an assumed social inequality. That the social inequality was so huge in terms of a small caste Hindu elite dominating and being the hegemon, that you could afford that kind of democracy. You could afford that kind of a universal suffrage because that did not really, in any meaningful sense, threaten the social hierarchies and privileges. So I think Indian political democracy, while from one shade looks to be fairly radical, I think there is this background story to it. What is happening today, I feel, is that there is a breakdown of that old kind of patron-client relation. That gap between social inequality may not be in substantive sense, but in some sense is changing post-neoliberalism. That also makes, case for Samir, that makes even neoliberalism very complex phenomena, that you cannot have an out-and-out critique of neoliberalism, especially in countries like India, that have had massive inequalities. Neoliberalism allowed for some kind of a tenuous mobility, tenuous inclusion. I think what we are witnessing today is politics, and that's what populism. That's why I do not really, rubbish populism of even the right kind, because I think it's articulating a new kind of a politics that is post-patron-client. That that now there is a new kind of people do not want to be patronized. Whether it's Dalits, whether it is Muslims, whether it is Dalit, OBCs, whether it is women. So you might want, but so you need equality, but in a new language. It needs a completely new kind of an idiom, which I think the old kind of Nehruvian social democracy simply cannot afford. Even I would argue it's old kind of constitutional imagination simply cannot afford. And therefore populism has, right-wing populism, I think hopefully provisionally filled that space, this kind of aggressiveness, this kind of competitive language, this kind of retributive. I think all this somewhere is symbolic of that welcome breakdown of old kind of patron-client networks. But we really do not have a vision of what this alternative would look like. And that's where Congress is struggling. Congress is still articulating its politics in this old kind of, that's also flows from the question that I asked Nyla, that that there are even the regional elite in places like Kashmir, practically in every state, are being questioned today. That they are not undisputed leaders like perhaps they were at Sheikh Abdullah Saab's time. But now you do not have that kind of a privilege any longer. So there is that patron-client breakdown, which is, I think, welcome in a democracy. But we do not really have an alternative. Partly we do not have an alternative because neoliberalism has not allowed for those kind of social material conditions for people to realize. So in one sense, discursively, democracy has reached the last person in India. Everybody today can think in terms of some egalitarian imagination, but there are no concrete means of realizing them. I think that is the space this kind of a very authoritarian populism is filling by telling you the person next to you is an enemy. Sometimes it's Muslim, sometimes it's that anybody who is weak and vulnerable can easily occupy that imagination, and you get some kind of a psychological gratification which can be momentary. But then you can always critique that, but then people would tell you, I think Pragya can bear me on this, is that people will tell you this this psychological gratification is better than not having any alternative. In my own surveys, when I go and did surveys in my village, in my areas, sometimes it comes, people shock you with the kind of clarity they have. They tell you, हम जानते हैं कि ये बालाकोट झूठ है. Something like that never happened. But कम से कम पाकिस्तान को threaten तो किए. At least we showed a strong face. So this normative between black and white really collapses. They at least feel a sense of happiness that you have humiliated Pakistan, even if it's by fraudulent means, doesn't matter. Even if it's a momentary gratification. I think this comes from a deep sense of vacuum, which is generating a Nietzschean kind of nihilism. And I feel at the heart of this project of right-wing populism is a kind of a nihilism. That's where I wanted to. Samir, you're back. You went for a break, but the question that I really had for you was this: that the kind of issues that you really brought about in terms of constitutionalism. In Indian case, left was the first political force to really reject constitution as a bourgeois document. Much of left parliament, not but extra parliamentary, extra institutional left was the first one to sort of. And today you see that the same left forces turning on their head and actually are in the project of protecting the constitution. This is like we have really come a full circle. Something that we took for granted, half a century back, today looks like so precious. You took for granted citizenship, you took for granted your legal status, some welfare policies, idea of mobility. But today suddenly, all this looks kind of a precariat kind of. That's where it takes me to the kind of philosophical question you raised on liberalism. That when somebody reads like Walzer's classical essay on liberalism and art of separation, he says that liberalism is a theory of walls. It builds walls between civil society and state, between family and civil society, individual and collective, social, political, economic domains. And it says that it is through building these walls, it gives freedom. It builds an idea of freedom. And that's what his critique of Marxism really is, that Marxism collapses, that it doesn't really see an autonomous civil sphere operating in capitalism. But Walzer argues that we have to further strengthen these walls to actually actualize that freedom in civil sphere. I think we on the left and the progressive secular democrat front today, in an epistemic sense, are really caught in this dilemma that we are not in a position to reject liberalism. The way Smith would do that. Liberalism itself leads us to state of exception. That we, on one hand, want to protect these liberal freedoms. We see now a new meaning in these liberal freedoms. Yet we know that these are not substantive. These are not going to deliver. A place like Kashmir, I don't think we'll ever get justice through this liberal constitutional language. So we are really, in a public debate, we are really caught between, this kind of a sense of critiquing, and that's precisely what I think has happened on ground, Samir. That left was the first, perhaps, force to critique the language of institutions in India. Left had a robust critique of all institutions, and it perhaps offered a very valid critique that all institutions are depositories of social power. They exclude more than include, including places like universities. And that kind of a critique over a period of time today has boiled down to, in popular politics. And what right is articulating is precisely that kind of a critique of institutions, that there was no rule of law in the real sense. But right articulates it not to strengthen rule of law, but to actually further degenerate into to some kind of open policy of illegality. I think so how would you respond to because you take a very robust. I also had this question about where do you see post-colonial intervention in this kind of context. Post-colonial theory had a very distinct intervention from that of Marxism, and I see many of my post-colonial friends suddenly caught on wrong foot. The kinds of imageries and narratives they've used is what the right is today using. Kinds of community, religion. So they have gone silent. I mean, in one sense, they perhaps wanted to articulate what was internally, but today we suddenly see that some of us have been debating. That first book of mine on critique of Chatterjee's on political society precisely argued that we seem to be exaggerating this cultural idiom of the subaltern. In my personal conversation with Ashish Nandi, I asked him, how do you see the situation now? He very reluctantly said, maybe we exaggerated, this whole composite subaltern, kind of a thing in Indian context. So they are also, like us, who are suspended now in one sense, they are also, I think, theoretically suspended. So there's a welcome churning that's happening, which is not just political, but also in an epistemic sense. So I would really love to have your reflections on that, which actually takes me to Pragya's point, the point that you made right at the end, Pragya, that people say that when you talk a language of discrimination, people say farak nahi padta, because discrimination existed all through. In an everyday life for a Muslim, I've done surveys in Telangana or Dalits. They actually, I should narrate a very interesting anecdote to you in my when I was talking to my students. When I got agitated with akhlaq being lynched or Dalits being lynched, they said, "Sir, ye aapke liye naya hai." You are, because now the TV is covering. This is everyday reality in villages. Over even a small change, chutta theek se nahi de raha, ya somebody, Dalit walk through. No, there is a lynching, and this has been the reality. So I think this kind of our kind of a left liberal, now that we sort of suddenly happen to see through the reality beyond the Nehruvian glass, window sheet that, I think Kashmiris were first to see with Sheikh Abdullah Saab's arrest. I think we came much later, after 30 years. Now we are seeing that Nehruvian illusion of social democracy created. I think to a large extent is the reason why our kind of articulation of issues don't really resonate with common people. People tell me that, my students, Dalit and Muslim students, Dalit students told me that when you cry foul for akhlaq, lynching, majority of other groups see this as a very selective outrage. आप अखलाक के लिए करते हो, बाकी के लिए न्यू क्यों नहीं करते? क्योंकि every other community, every other caste is facing a similar kind of violence. There's nothing unique. So I think what Hindutva is really doing is that it is basing itself on the generic discrimination, depravity, and everyday violence, and internally reworking and giving it an ideological color of Hindutva. I think it is doing this in every state. You go to Bengal, already huge amount of networks. There are violent transactions within that CPM, and then TMC has put in place. So there is nothing new that BJP, it doesn't, for common people, it doesn't look that BJP is bringing this new totalitarian monolithic regime, because they are using similar strategies. What they do is they give an ideological color to that transaction. For instance, local transactions of mafia type. I think when a BJP kind of party or RSS walks in, they give a Hindu tinge, a Hindu network to that. There is some evidence that is coming out. So I think from common people's point of view, would it be right to say that the kind of outrage that we feel that there's something absolutely radically new that is happening with the rise of BJP is more in terms of the ideological turn that we are worried about. But I think on the ground, in terms of everyday social events, everyday politics, my own hunch is that people fail to see that it is something so distinctive. That these kinds of violations, this kind of unaccountable violence, this kind of state repression has always been happening in India all through. There's absolutely nothing new. What BJP is doing is giving a Hindu turn, a majoritarian religious turn to that. People feel, I think, is partly justified. At least, there is at least some dharmic tinge, religious tinge to the depravity. So I think that's where I think when we go out and say something outrageous is happening, this is fascism, this is that, people stay back at you. They say, "Aisa kuch nahi ho raha hai. It's only you guys feeling this." So we do not know whether we are the ones in delirium or it is the people we think people are in delirium and people are hallucinating and imagining Modi as this larger than life figure. But people might turn back and think we are the ones who hallucinated all through that there was big time democracy and social democracy in India, and that therefore I think the reason why RSS and BJP do not really repel the lay normativity, everyday ethics of people is because these things have happened for way too long in India. I think there's nothing new that they do in terms of everyday violence. So does this make sense to you when you go around talking to Muslims and Dalits? That this kind of depravity always existed. So with those kind of very uh, ad hoc remarks, I would then now move on to the panelists, and we would begin with Nyla. And and I think Nyla, you've also got Kashmir is the elephant. Once you flag Kashmir, it sort of puts everything on the back burner. I think you got the largest number of questions. People have strong differences, so that was expected in a sense.
Yes.
So what we will do is that you could sort of respond to me, and if you have any question for the co-panelists, you can do that in the first round. And in the final round, I think very briefly we can take up if you want to say something about the questions you got and rest of the panelists also.
Okay. So I have responded to a couple of questions, Ajay. I would like to echo what a couple of the panelists said about homogenization in India and the creation or the legitimization of a monolithic Indian identity, and how difference is being criminalized. So minorities, Muslims, women, Dalits, etc., we see them being even further marginalized, and their cultural differences, religious differences are criminalized. But exactly as you said, this is nothing new. We've seen this kind of homogenization with the Congress as well. The Congress was probably a little more subtle about it than the BJP, but nevertheless, integrative measures, attempts to create a monolithic Indian identity, attempts to erode federalism, all those took place in successive Congress governments as well, right? Now, you asked me a couple of questions about Kashmir, and I didn't take them down. I should have, but I will try and remember, and I'll try and respond as clearly as possible. So you're absolutely correct. The Jammu and Kashmir of today is highly fragmented. Politically, religiously, over the years, we have seen an exacerbation of religious, regional, and political divides. And local political organizations, whether mainstream or separatist, made no attempt or made no substantive attempt to bridge those regional divides or to bridge those religious divides. So you talked about having conducted surveys in Kashmir and having spoken to people who observed that they wanted the creation of an Islamic state. That is one constituency in the valley that probably feels that it needs to have a strong religious identity to hold on to. That in this world of cultural majoritarianism, religious majoritarianism, manifested in acts of violence all across India, there is probably a section in Kashmir that feels like they need to be able to hold on to their religious identity, and that would give them a sense of security. But I would argue that that is one constituency. There is another constituency that still owes allegiance to the idea of a diverse and pluralistic Jammu and Kashmir in which we accommodate diverse religious ideologies as well as political ideologies. And a Jammu and Kashmir in which we are able to build common ground between those diverse religious and political ideologies, right? Now, I would say that over the years, we have seen, as you all know, we've seen militarization in Kashmir. We have seen egregious human rights violations committed by state actors as well as by non-state actors, which has bred, and rightly so, justifiably so, which has bred resentment, anger. People have been pushed to the wall, particularly after the revocation of Article 370 in the state constitution on August 5th, 2019. Even mainstream political actors were pushed to the wall, because all this while they claimed that they wanted a solution within the framework of the Indian Constitution, right? All this while they claimed that they owed allegiance to the Indian Constitution. But on August 5th, 2019, even those mainstream political actors were rendered irrelevant. Even their voices were stifled. So in effect, all Kashmiris were pigeonholed, right? In effect, all Kashmiris were stereotyped as dissidents, anti-national, militants, whatever. We saw that kind of blatant criminalization. But I would say that post the revocation of Article 370, the Buddhists of Leh, the Shia Muslims of Kargil, the Dogra Hindus of Jammu have all realized that they enjoyed certain benefits which were bestowed on all of them by the Land to the Tiller Bill. That the Land to the Tiller Bill, which made peasants proprietors of the lands they tilled, had not benefited only the Muslims of Kashmir, but that bill had benefited the Hindu Dogras of Jammu, the Buddhists of Leh, the Shia Muslims of Kargil, right? After statehood was revoked and Article 370 was revoked, the political situation in the Kashmir Valley continued to remain unstable as it does today. So any kind of tycoon in mainland India, business tycoon, industrialist, would much rather invest in Jammu than in the Kashmir Valley, right? Which made the Hindu Dogras of Jammu realize that their existence was in jeopardy, that their land rights, that their property rights were in jeopardy, that they were not in a position to compete with industrialists or business tycoons from mainland India. And it then dawned on them that the Land to the Tiller Bill had been enormously beneficial for them as well. That the religious color that the BJP had given that bill was highly questionable. The Buddhists of Leh also rose against the revocation of statehood then, right? So that has in a way brought them together. More recently, Ajay, the BJP government criminalized the Roshni Act, or the Jammu and Kashmir State Land Act of 2001. And for a while, the people of Jammu thought that wouldn't impact them at all. The people of Leh thought that wouldn't impact them at all. That the only people who would be impacted by the revocation of the Jammu and Kashmir State Land Act of 2001 would be the elite Muslims of the Kashmir Valley. But that again was a myth. created by the BJP, which has been dispelled. It has now been established that the Hindu Dogras of Jammu, and not just the elite class, benefited more from the Jammu and Kashmir State Land Act of 2001 than the elite Muslims of Kashmir. You see? So rendering that act null and void would adversely impact the Hindu Dogras of Jammu a lot more than it would the Muslims of Kashmir. So I think there is a very, very substantive attempt to build bridges between the religious communities of Jammu and Kashmir at this point, particularly with the District Development Council elections that are happening as we speak. And those elections have seen a large turnout. And I would argue that the large turnout is not evidence of renewed faith in the electoral process. On the contrary, it is a unified effort to reject the BJP, to turn the BJP out of Jammu and Kashmir. And the kind of campaigning, the kind of electioneering that we have seen during the entire process of the District Development Council elections brought the people of Jammu, Kashmir, as well as Ladakh on the same platform. So that is what I would, did I respond to all your questions, Ajay? Ajay, can you hear me?
Dr. Ajay? Ajay sir, can you hear us?
Yeah.
Ajay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you, Professor Nyla.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. But you made a very interesting point about federalism and whether regional local political parties would have the grit and the courage to renew their ideological bases. I think that's an excellent question, because over the years, what I have seen in Jammu and Kashmir and in some other parts of mainland India as well, is political lethargy, intellectual apathy, as well as political lethargy. So I think quite a few regional parties in Jammu and Kashmir were invested in the politics of ad hocism, right? Winning the next election, forming the government, sort of, as you pointed out, day-to-day transactions. And they forgot to renew the ideologies that they had been built on. Their politics became more about constantly negotiating with the federal government of India. Their politics became more about vested interests, not the interests and the benefits of the entire populace of the state. So renewing their ideologies would take a lot of work, but I think that kind of work is much needed. We need all right, that word is a tongue twister, so I'm going to use a different word. We need the revival of a politics of mass mobilization that is intertwined with the revival of democratic institutions, as well as demilitarization in Jammu and Kashmir. And when I say demilitarization, I mean that the forte of the military is the protection of borders. The forte of the military is not interference in democratic and civil society institutions. And as I pointed out in my presentation, there is a very thin line of demarcation between military interventions and military peacekeeping. So calling for demilitarization in conjunction with a politics of mass mobilization and renewal of democratic institutions is the need of the day. I hope I was clear enough.
Absolutely, Nyla. That was really great. So we'll now ask Samir to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Ajay, for your excellent and incisive questions. I'll try to be, as brief as possible. I think that when the Canadian Constitution was being patriated in 1981, 1982, the left evinced a similar critique, and that related to what I said earlier in terms of, and also reflecting your own introductory remarks, that that constitutionalism itself must be seen as fundamentally suspect in the eyes of the left insofar as it accords inordinate power to an unelected governmental body, which is to say the courts. So there was skepticism immediately, but then once the Constitution was put into place, and we had a written Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the left came to see it in more ambivalent terms, to be sure. And I think that relates to the question of the fact that, or the question of the status of the state itself. We have to remember, and I think the kind of white elephant in the room here is the fact that the state is not just a neoliberal state, but it's a capitalist state. And if we follow theorists like Poulantzas, we see that the state is a kind of terrain of struggle. It's contradictory in and of itself. And this must also then enter into the constellation of institutions that comprise liberal democracy. I think the left often forgets the fact that that constellation didn't simply drop from the sky, but was the function of struggles, often for which people were injured and maimed and even killed. Struggles of civil rights organizations, immigrant organizations, women's organizations, gays and lesbians, trade unions, and so on. We have to remember that these struggles go into constituting the constitutional and liberal democratic order. And if we do that, if we historicize that, then we understand that order to be a contingent one, and that must always, in a sense, be subject to reversal and regression. And I think this is what we're seeing today. So it must be defended, but then it also, and this goes back to my comments, it must be, in a sense, deepened and further democratized. The democratic state itself needs to be democratized insofar as it is still a capitalist state. So I think this is what needs to be considered. There's also the historical experience of Stalinism, the historical experience of revolutions that calcified and fundamentally betrayed their own ends and objectives and ideals. So I think that the left today has to really be a 21st century left that must find a way of making some kind of peace with, or have a better understanding of how it stands vis-a-vis liberalism, not neoliberalism, but political liberalism. And it must, I think, engage in a dialogue with precisely figures like with Michael Waltz or Charles Taylor and others. And of course, Habermas himself has been central to this discussion. And I think here the idea of legitimation crisis, I think, haunts this discussion, doesn't it? Insofar as I mean, I don't like the terms and the premises of the concept of legitimation crisis insofar as it's based on this bifurcated understanding of systems integration and social integration. I think it's just far too mechanical. But he's onto something very profound here, that there is a twin set of imperatives within the capitalist state to both, on the one hand, foster accumulation and then also seek ongoing legitimation. And these are coming into ever greater conflict with one another. And there needs to be some way beyond this impasse. And I think this is exactly what we're in part trying to address here. I'd also say that theoretically there have been some interesting attempts to look differently at Marx's own writings, and I'm sure you're familiar with the book by Miguel Albansur, Democracy Against the State, Marx in the Machiavellian Moment, where he does a reading of Marx's critique of Hegel, to show that there's an implicit understanding of Republican constitutionalism in the early Marx. And that's something that could, in a sense, be drawn out and further developed. And at a more, let's say, practical level, the level of, say, practical reason and contemporary history, I think there's some interesting experiments in leftist constitution making in Latin America, right? In Chile, in Ecuador, and Bolivia. And the idea in Bolivia and Ecuador that we should, in fact, understand nature as the bearer of certain kinds of rights. And I think this is very promising as well. So I think just to sum up and conclude, we really need to understand constitutions not as reified, but living documents that have to, in a sense, always be renewed in order for their legitimacy, in order for the constellation of institutions that sit under their umbrella, and the legitimacy of those institutions to remain intact. They must be renewed on an ongoing basis. Of course, the way that renewal happens is very delicate, and it does provide some openings for forces that would actually seek to undermine that order completely. And I think this is what's on the agenda in terms of right-wing populism, because there is, in the very idea of populism, an appeal to the people, of course, and the people sits at the very heart of this thing we're calling democracy. Right? So there is a way in which that liberal democratic order can be subverted from within by the use of the very language of democracy, as you put it at the beginning, and maybe this is coming full circle back to your remarks, but also what I've written about, and that is the idea of illiberal democracy. Right? So I think that this is really what's at stake here. And I think the stakes are high, and it's a very dangerous time precisely because of, let's say, the fluidity of the dynamics within and without these institutions, or both within and inside of them and also outside of them, the pressures that are brought to bear from outside, but also the internal weaknesses given this ongoing legitimation crisis that we're seeing in India and Canada and globally. Thank you.
Excellent, Samir, thanks so much for that. And Niranjan, over to you.
Ajay, before Niranjan goes, can I reinforce something that Samir said a little while ago? Samir talked about liberal democracies. I would like to point out that the unitary concept of nationalism that the BJP subscribes to challenges the very basic principle that the nation was founded on, which is the principle of democracy. And in the nationalist project of the BJP, one of the forms that the nullification of past and present histories takes is the subjection of religious minorities to an authoritarian and centralized state. And that is what is happening in India today.
Right, yes, I think that's a very pertinent reflection, Nyla. Thanks for that. Niranjan, you want to come in?
Yeah, I think you raised some of the very interesting points for us to further this debate. I think one of them what you actually said is very correct about Nehruvian social democracy, and how uh, the entire fast I think couple of decades the way it went with political representation of Dalit and OBC and many other this, they got representation but symbolically, and not the real power in a sense. So it was more of a small kind of well-educated elites who control the, but that's actually not a very surprising thing. I mean, if you look at the entire all over the world, actually, if you look at the way democratization has happened in starting with the United States, and if you look at even in Europe and many other parts, even Australia, I think most of the cases it has happened gradually. If you look at extending rights and providing representation and including many other groups. In fact, Native Americans got more than after 145 years, they got the equal rights actually, after the American Constitution was enacted. And you have seen New Zealand and Australia, for Aboriginal and the native population, it took so much of time. Actually, in that sense, we are actually what you said. We started with the radical kind of idea of universal adult suffrage and providing rights to everyone, irrespective of their caste, creed, and religion, gender. So in that sense, we started, and the way we moved, of course, I think you have to really provide that democratic politics actually paved the way for that OBC upsurge and Dalit upsurge later on happened in the 80s and 90s. And that was actually I think a positive convergence, and it happened in a real way, not by just giving someone some kind of symbolic representation that you'll be given a cabinet post or a president's post or something. So it happened really on the street politics through the mobilization politics, and the way we saw actually 80s and 90s and early 2000s. I mean, someone like Mayawati becoming chief minister in a most feudal and casteist state like Uttar Pradesh is unimaginable. It's almost like Barack Obama becoming president. Black in a country that practice slavery and so much oppression for centuries. So in a sense, this is revolutionary things we have seen, and this all has happened within the democratic constitutional framework, without any bloodshed or any sort of way that you have seen in Africa and in many other parts have seen sort of civil war, and then so many times they have written their constitution and destroyed and then rewritten, and it. So in that sense, we have seen that, but today, if you look at especially the right of right wing and especially the way the cultural projects has actually progressed, and the idea of nationhood and idea of inclusion, idea of exclusion, and all that today the way it's moving, especially when religion is becoming a major force, and in a sense it is actually overcoming the caste and other kind of defense that put and made this country truly multicultural and diverse, is actually in many ways disappearing. So today, I mean, if you look at Uttar Pradesh, the way that sort of polarization has happened, and largely through religious polarizations, it's a very successful project. If you look at 2017 elections, and then what happened in the, we thought that is probably one incident, but if you have seen 2019 elections results, it only reconfirms, that the kind of projects, that kind of idea, they, this particular ideological group is pushing has succeeded, and we don't know how long this will continue. So in a sense, today what you are seeing is that Dalits and OBCs, many of those who actually made their mark and politically they got representation on their own way, are being co-opted in many ways. Actually, they're almost similar like Congress. It's going back to the Congress years actually, almost. If you look at, it's another dominant party that is trying to co-opt, with even a lot of regional parties are in many ways actually making peace with them, and they're thinking that it's not better to pose it sort of way to the ruling party, rather do business. So we are actually witnessing that sort of. It's probably, I would say, it's a sort of whatever gains we made actually in those 2-3 decades, previous decades, probably we are seeing actually sort of that gains is probably disappearing in many way. Of course, we don't know. It may not continue forever. You might see, I mean, there will be contradiction which will sooner or later emerge from the Hindu religion itself being such a diverse and plural religions. But for the timing, it's And then second issue, I thought I'll reflect something. I'll jump in. You said about neoliberalism and that globalization and how that has actually created a sort of sense or created a vacuum that people I'll just say that what the kind of a work people like Francis Fukuyama have written about identity and globalization and other thing, that narrative fits well. For last two and 3 decades, the neoliberal say and the technocratic and that kind of wealth creation and the inequality that we have seen in a sense, and then and then the movement of people, that immigration and the concept of citizenship in many countries have actually largely because of demographic change, as well as changes in workforce and many other things, economic and other milieu. You feel that certainly majority community in many countries like United States, and if you look at in even in many parts of Europe, they feel probably like even a small immigrant population is a big threat for them. So it's a kind of sort of a false imagination of the thing, and that is what and with economic decline and the social decline in many way, and like what we are witnessing in our country also, like people feel that they are not getting respect. It is entire power has been captured by the lieutenant delights or Khan market gang or whatever, and they are the one who are rotating. It's simply similar logic you see in the United States, that Washington elites who are actually rotating, that Hillary Clinton and which has been so in a sense Trump, what you saw in Trump is a kind of revolt, and what you are seeing in India and many other parts like Brazil and other places is also sort of it's a kind of revolt against the elites and established sort of a system which they think is very plutocratic, corrupt and oligarchic, and in many ways they are the one who would not allow others to benefit. So what we are actually seeing is these are byproduct of globalization, and then the kind of neoliberal path that we have followed for last several decades, which has created a huge social, cultural other problem, and nativist ideas, nativist feelings are now coming out very so people on the street, whatever happening, even the violence, other thing, certain people, the mobs actually are now empowered in many ways. By launching the violence or lynching, other thing, many of them feel derive a sense, what you said, a sense of gratification. They feel that the power is with in their hands now, because the rule of law and the state completeness are very, very open. You can easily see that. So in a sense, the ruling dispensations, anywhere in many of these countries are actually doing it in a very discreet and a way, so that allow the mob to vent their frustration of the thing, and at the same time they monopolize the power and narrative. So I would say this is a sort of cycle. Hopefully it's a short-term cycle, and we'll overcome with things improving, probably economy situation improving, and the situation with regard to equality and many other things improving. So many things have to actually really improve, and probably provide a kind of sort of a challenge or sort of counter this sort of trend. I hope this is a very short kind of trend.
We are all hoping for that, Niranjan, that it is a short trend, but one does not know. I think India, compared to other countries, is distinct in terms of issues of dignity and self-respect. I think are very unique to India compared to all other nations. So these dimensions might add actually more ominous trends, and we might be here for a long haul. But anyway, as Gramsci said, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So I think we have no choice but to be with optimists to continue. So I would ask now, request Pragya to share her thoughts.
Okay, I'll be really quick. The thing is, very often after an election, you wonder why people voted a certain way. Why, if according to general media assessment, the government was failing on all fronts, political, social in particular, in managing the contradictions and in the economy, why then did people facilitate the victory of the BJP or one of its allies or all of them together? I've learned not to expect people to be very enlightened when they vote, but I've also started to expect that they would be a little bit more pragmatic, realistic about what they can get, what they can lose or gain by voting in a certain way. Of course, you have to leave it to people's wisdom, but I think a key role is played by the media. you're not explaining, most of the media is not explaining the complications which are inherent to economy of this size, politics this contradictory, and to, a party which rules for, a fixed number of years and made certain promises. There is no assessment of whether those promises were fulfilled or not. So 5 years is a very long time. If you promise something in the first year of the government, there should be a realistic assessment at the end of that term, which does not happen any longer. It used to happen. UPA 1's Bharat Nirman, UPA 2's Bharat Nirman was constantly assessed. The problem then at times used to be that, the government's own people used to be called by the media to assess it, which is really not fair. But right now, there is no assessment at all. We are constantly churning out data which contradicts itself. The government conceals data from, I would say, the media. And so the media cannot tell it. But there is also a reluctance to criticize the government for where its flaws are obvious. There is a reluctance to analyze. Now, I mean, the NRC, it's you're squeezing the idea of citizenship over decades. You are also changing the idea of citizenship from one parent to both parents, and then you're making all kinds of documentation necessary, but you're not saying which document. So if the media is not going to tell people, then how are they supposed to make a realistic assessment? They'll just go by the power structure around them. Also, I don't think people are necessarily, I don't know if they're becoming nihilistic because of this, but because of the way they vote or don't vote. But I think there is a change in perception about their own status. Very often people perceive themselves to be powerful, strong, dominant, when that might not necessarily be true. A lot of Hindus were excluded in the NRC process in Assam. I know it's not a like for like comparison. 19 lakh people did get excluded who were not Muslims. So why did the Hindus of Delhi, where there's a protest going on, not sort of realize this or accept this fact? A, again, media. B, they tend to trust the political leaders. What the BJP top leaders will tell them will generally have more of an impact, because the media has also been systematically discredited. And then when the opposition has not just to put its the opposition's role is not just to put its point across, but to build a narrative. So when the most powerful section, when the institutions are not telling the truth, how do you counter? Let's face it, how do you counter a lie? You can counter a claim with a counterclaim, but when it's a lie, all you'll have to say is that wo matlab jhoot bol rahe hai. Huh? So so in this kind of scenario, I really don't know if they're nihilistic or misled or just refusing to believe something because it's more convenient not to believe the opposite right now. But definitely the media itself is playing a very big role in not letting people find out and distracting them with evening debates, which most media persons themselves don't watch. That's a fact. And it's very difficult to grapple with the complications of economy of this size going through a huge transition. So actually a lot of time and energy needs to be spent to do it, which I don't know if most of the mainstream press is going to do.
Thanks, Pragya, you're right.
Thanks.
She brought that view from the speech. But yesterday's Rajasthan municipal election, people surprised you that BJP lost and it came a distant third. So
Yes.
people always surprise you in India. Just when you
Yes.
think it's a lost case, I mean, that's where the Gramscian common sense, what operates, we really don't understand. So when last time Congress party had invited me for some closed door meeting, I started by telling them that you guys know when you lose an election why you lose, but you do not know why you win an election. There's no reason why Congress should be winning anywhere. They are do next to nothing. But so that's the crisis we are really in. People are
Why
willing
wait?
to
They've
vote
done
just
everything. I've heard more about the Congress and the BJP rule than I heard about them when they were in power for 10 years. Congress did this, Congress did that. That's what we hear all the time.
Yeah, there are things that they have done, that's true, right? But in the last 5 years, people, do they really have a reason to so actively vote out BJP and elect Congress? I don't know. I mean, that's
Yeah.
where we seem to have been. I think that's partly what Chantal Mouffe talks about. Neoliberalism has really eradicated the difference between parties. They all have same economic policies, like what we're witnessing farmers' movement. Congress pretty much would have done the same thing if they were in power. Maybe in a much more, little more civil way, less conspiratorial, less criminalizing the dissent, but they would have done pretty much the same, even with the regional parties. So I think, and that's what the BJP is concerned. I think they're right there in saying that Congress had this on their manifesto. So in that sense, people do not really have a reason to vote out so actively. So once I was talking to an auto guy, they said sub party same है, कम से कम बीजेपी वाले धर्म का तो बात करते हैं, at least they give you something on religion. So I think people have a robust common sense and they have a reason why they do something when they do. And I go with them. Why not BJP? At least they're telling Hindu. At least Prime Minister Modi goes to Varanasi Ghat and does something for people. Other parties have nothing much better to offer than what the BJP does. So I think we are really caught in that. I think your presentation really brought that vacuum. So we are hopelessly out of time. It makes absolutely no sense talking of time. But Arjun has messaged me saying that he wants to continue. But Arjun, we are famished. So I
I
don't know whether the panelists
also
would really
actually
want
want
to
to
continue.
have
And
a
Nyla, I think, had to leave. I'm sure Samir also has a long day.
I,
And I'm
yeah.
also completely famished, want to go and eat something. But if
Yes.
you want, I think we can
Yeah.
ask them quickly to respond to the questions. They've got 1 minute each,
Yes.
is what we can do.
yeah.
Yes, for the
Arjun?
concluding rounds, we can go quickly to Professor
Yeah,
To all the panelists, and then for Ajay sir to just
yeah.
quickly wrap it up, and we can have a formal
No,
vote
no,
of
there's
thanks.
nothing wrap. I've already wrapped.
Yes,
There's how many rounds of
very nice.
wrapping will we do?
No, very nicely.
We have
So we
done
can
that.
now, I hope, quickly go to, yes, Professor Nyla. Yes, ma'am, over to
Okay,
you.
okay, Arjun.
So,
So let's start with
Arjun,
Nyla. I think you have a lot of questions. I don't think you can go question by just
Sir,
the feel and something.
I will email all the questions in over email to all the panelists.
email them to me.
Yes.
I did respond to a couple of them in the chat box, Arjun.
Um,
Real quick, I would like to say that while the right in India has done the nation no favors, that the left needs to refurbish and renew itself as well. Right? Every movement initiated by the left, every subaltern movement is not progressive. We have had some obscurantist subaltern movements as well, which have done greater damage or just as much damage as the right. Right? So it's important to be aware of that, because some people tend to glorify the left, tend to glorify everything it stands for. But it has supported, as I said, some obscurantist, regressive movements as well. It's important to keep that in mind. The second thing, Samir pointed out that constitutions need to be renewed. I completely agree. And I would point out, I would argue that every progressive provision of the Constitution of India has not been fully implemented. You see, so when a constitution, when an emancipatory constitution is drafted, it provides people with a vantage point from where they can envision a different future, a new destiny. But the constitution of a country provides a strong framework, but it is for those who are responsible for the smooth functioning of institutional mechanisms of government to implement constitutional provisions. And several of those progressive provisions have not been fully implemented. That's what I would argue. And with the courage of conviction, I would like to end by reinforcing that we need more decentralization of powers in India. Federating units need to be invested with the autonomy that they have been seeking for decades now. And I would also, real quick, before I end, I would like to say that the people of Jammu and Kashmir are not cannon fodder. And it is important for rational people to hold up a mirror to the state. And it is just as important for us to hold up a mirror to non-state actors as well. I have no sympathy for those politicians, policymakers, or academics who get grist for their mills by the sufferings of the people of Kashmir. I have no sympathy for such people. I have no patience for them, right? So we need a genuine political process in Kashmir that would recognize the legitimate political aspirations of the people of that place, that would recognize every stakeholder and try to bring them all to the table in order to foster dialogue, to create common ground, to negotiate. There is no politics without negotiation, right? If every stakeholder in mainland India and every stakeholder in Jammu and Kashmir holds on to his or her rigid position, then all we will see is intransigence. And that's how some people get grist for their mills. Intransigence, problems, simmering anger, simmering discontent. But we need to be talking about solutions that would accommodate multiple political points of view and ideology. So that's what I would like to end with, Arjun.
Beautiful. Thank you, ma'am. Yes.
Thank you.
So, yes, can we go to Dr. Samir? Yes, please.
Yeah, thank
Is it
you.
okay if I leave?
Yes, sure. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was so nice to meet everyone.
Ma'am, please let us know when you visit New Delhi.
I will,
Please
for
do.
sure.
Yes.
I
Thank
will.
you.
I will. Thanks. Bye.
Yes, Dr.
So, yeah, thank you. I just realized after I'd finished answering the questions posed by Ajay that I hadn't actually done my job thoroughly enough, and that is that there was this very important question about the post-colonial condition and how it might have inadvertently played into some of the, well, I mean, as was just said, the certain obscurantist tendencies, not least of which the BJP itself. There is a way of tying it directly into the constitutional question in Canada, ironically, and that is the fact that in, I think it was 1979, the Quebec government commissioned a certain French philosopher by the name of Jean-François Lyotard to write a report on the condition of knowledge. And this became the postmodern condition, right? And so what Lyotard articulates here, and I'll be very brief, and I'm sure people are familiar with the book, but just to remind people, this is a book that argues that postmodernism is an incredulity towards meta-narratives. It's a skepticism about meta-narratives. Two meta-narratives in particular, the narrative of absolute knowledge in Hegel, which also, you know, means Wissenschaft or science. And there's also the meta-narrative of the eventual triumph of communism in the end of history via Marx. And this is scientific socialism. What is interesting here is that there's a critique of the universalizing narrative, which really is also about science, and a recourse to Wittgenstein and the idea of language games and a petit récit as opposed to grand récit. So rather than the meta-narratives, you have these local narratives, right? And this then becomes the postmodern condition of being, in a sense, receptive and open to the plurality of language games that are played across a diversity of, let's say, even regions and nations and so on. And I think we can see how this can directly play in then to the possibility of a certain post-colonial discourse, which valorizes the local and the regional, the subaltern, and it cuts it loose from any mediation or dialectic with some universalizing dimensions, human rights. And interesting what has been said about human rights in recent years in India, that this Western idea of human rights, it doesn't apply. We have our own understanding of human rights, which is radically particularistic, you know. So I think there's this, let's say, uncomfortable affinity between a certain sort of right politics, right populism and authoritarianism, and postmodernism, post-colonialism. And my last point to conclude would be to say that the point of intersection really is the French Nouvelle Droit. And we have a chapter in the book on this. And it really is in the late 1980s that you have people like Alain de Benoit, in a sense, articulating a postmodern form of right-wing discourse, which is actually quite extreme. And the idea is essentially that we valorize cultural difference. However, these differences ought to be, in a sense, bolstered and maintained by, if necessary, by force, right? So you have this idea of cultural separation, which is a particular understanding of the logic of postmodernity itself. So this is quite uncomfortable, I think, for those who consider themselves to be sort of postmodern leftists. The abandonment of universalism is a very dangerous terrain, I think, and has to be fundamentally rethought, which gets back to the idea of thinking about the relationship between Marxism and liberalism. But that's a large discussion. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating, Samir. And you have some questions, Niranjan? You have...
No, I think I'll for the time and constant. I don't have anything to add, but just say that we India, at least I can say with a bit of confidence as a political scientist, that we have entered a uncharted territory, and we simply don't know which way we will be heading on for next probably 1 or 2 decades. It's going to be probably a decade of decades of turmoil and anxiety, and we all have to actually as active citizen and concerned sort of academic or critic of all regimes, we have to be all the more probably be alert and stay focused. And with this, I think I want to thank Ajay for very provocative and engaging questions and keeping this very alive, and Arjun and Simi for carrying this forward, and fantastic job. Thank you everyone, and my co-panelist also, I'm very grateful.
Thanks, Niranjan. So over to Pragya.
Yes.
Pragya,
Very tough job for you. Very tough job for you during COVID. Going on ground.
It's okay. I mean, it was very tough sitting at home. It's much more difficult to be at home for 8 months. But thanks. I just wanted to thank you. Thank all the panelists. I'm glad we did this.
Yes,
Thank you.
it was quite interesting. We got quite a range of issues to discuss, from the field experience to. So Arjun, I think we should. I know you're still warming up, but we should call it a day.
Yes. Yes.
No. I'd also like to thank everybody and say how much I learned tonight. Thank you.
Yes. So let me also come to the formal sort of vote of thanks, but let me also thank Dr. Trevor Stock from University of Aberdeen, Scotland, who was also a scheduled panelist for this deliberation, but he also got COVID tested positive. So, but he has sent his good wishes. So we also wish him good health and to recover soon and participate in such a good enriching deliberation. I really learned a lot. And one thing I also wanted to just submit to this gathering, that now also the majoritarian, all the thing which we just spoke, as an economist, I'm just putting it across to all of you that the the instance has gone very soft on capitalism or liberalism. It is not becoming the center force. So there is always some other issues which is driving, and that thing is going on. There is not much getting done in all our economic thinking. We are getting the scene that there is a lot of oligarchy and that thing also. And after all the pandemic and all this depression, recession also, this thing gets, very much intensified. So other issues are also taking prominence, and we salute all of you political scientists for engaging in such a difficult conversation, especially in this time of pandemic. It has been really a march into knowledge this evening, and I would really like to thank all of you for such a treat. And uh, uh, obviously Dr. Ajay Gudavarti for directing this very important deliberation so smoothly, I would say. Because as a think tank, it's such a pleasure to produce a kind of deliberation, be a part of it. So let me go over to Dr. Simi so that we can, yes, just wrap and propose a word of thanks. Simi?
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, please go
Yes,
on.
thank you so much, Dr. Arjun. You have actually given or proposed the part of formal vote of thanks. So
Yes,
I will do the part, my bit.
please.
Actually, Ms. Pragya, I am also very glad that we were able to do it. Thank you so much. It was a treat. All the panelists, you have been so patient and composed, and you have reflected upon so important question about as Professor Nyla mentioned, decentralization, democracy, and at the core of everything is we the people. So the Constitution has to be upheld at all times because it begins and it ends with we the people. Um, and as a think tank, we really aim to bring in diverse points of views, and so that we have debates and deliberations for action based solutions to a host of issues, and we are committed to democracy, mobilization, and community building. You did a fantastic job, all the respected panelists, Professor Nyla, Professor Samir, Dr. Ajay. It wouldn't have been possible without you, Dr. Niranjan, Ms. Pragya. We are really grateful, and personally, as a political science student, it was a brush up of the entire theories of political science, and also I had a chance to update it as well. So thank you so much. And we have short the time by a lot, but still you have been with us, because as you could see, so many questions were coming up, so many interesting questions rather, and so much of interest from the people that this was needed. So I hope we will be able to gather again on another interesting discussion, and we will take it forward from there. Thank you so much, and have a very good day,
Thanks.
Professor Samir, and good night to all of
Thank
you.
you. Good night.
Dr. Ajay,
Thank you.
special
Thank,
thanks
thank
to you.
you, thank you, Arjun, for taking the initiative to organize
Thank
this.
you, Arjun.
Arjun, you are the one man behind the show. So thanks to you, and thanks to Samir for waking up early and joining us at
And
7
sir,
p.m.
and sir, you made all the sense because you said that
No.
you got up at 4:30. Yes.
I'm glad. I'm glad. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.
Good day
Bye.
and good
Good night.
night.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye
Arjun.
bye.
Thanks.
Evening.
Catch up, Samir, then.
Sure.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
See
Thank
you,
you.
guys.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.